Every time someone gets a bad grade, gets into an argument with their friend, or just has a rough day, they sigh dramatically and say, "I'm so depressed." Oftentimes, I even find myself saying these exact same words. However, it wasn't until I met someone with clinical depression that these words truly stuck with me. Depression and sadness were being used as synonyms, like happy and excited. Yet, depression isn't just sadness over a long period of time. Sadness fades when circumstances change. Depression doesn't. It lingers, gnawing at your energy, distorting your thoughts, and even making simple tasks feel like climbing a mountain. Unfortunately, major depressive disorder, or MDD, isn't just a mood. It isn't just something someone can quickly snap out of. In fact, according to the World Health Organization, or the WHO, depression is regarded as a psychiatric disease amongst the scientific community, altering the way the brain itself functions. And yet, like the boy who cried wolf, we overuse this term, degrading its meaning. This is dangerous because when we overuse this term, we trivialize it. We make it invisible. And when something is invisible, we don't try to innovate solutions for it. We don't fund better treatments and diagnostic methods for it. But most importantly, we don't even advocate for it. The truth is, depression is one of the greatest public health crises in our world today. According to the WHO, there are over 300 million people currently diagnosed with depression as of 2025. Specifically, they further by saying that depression is the leading cause of disability, exceeding disability caused by all forms of cancers and diabetes combined, as well as hypertensive heart diseases and strokes combined. This means that it keeps more people from participating and fully engaging in their daily lives than these aforementioned diseases do. And it doesn't just stop there. According to the World Economic Forum, depression drains up to $925 billion from the global economy in lost productivity every year. This means that it makes life living harder for families, children, workplaces, and the community. But most tragically, depression is often fatal. As a leading cause of suicide, more than 800,000 people die every year. That is one life lost every 40 seconds. Clearly, depression isn't just about having a bad week. It isn't something we can tell someone to get out of by trying to think positive or change their perspective. Although we call it a mental health disorder, depression sickens us like a disease, and like any other disease, it deserves to be treated with respect and seriousness. So, how do we treat depression now? Well, if someone is clinically diagnosed with depression and they walk into a clinic, the path forward is simple. The doctor may prescribe antidepressants, which are drugs that will allow the person to regulate their levels of serotonin and dopamine in the brain. Or they might be referred to go to some therapy. For example, there are lots of different types of therapies, including group therapy, psychodynamic therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and so on. In the most severe cases, they may be even referred to electroconvulsive therapy, which despite its history is still used as a last resort treatment. Each of these treatments work because they're solutions, but if we're being honest, they're not the best solutions. Unfortunately, according to the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, current diagnostic methods for depression rely on subjective assessments, allowing patients to falsify or exaggerate their emotions, resulting in inaccuracies of up to 30 to 50%. Even more, reliable methods of diagnostics rely on finding time to meet with a qualified psychiatrist or take expensive MRI or EEG scans, exacerbating inequities in healthcare. Furthermore, while it is believed that a chemical imbalance of serotonin and dopamine in the brain is the cause of depression, a recent meta-analysis study published in the journal Molecular Psychiatry finds that serotonin had little to no impact on the development of depression. This means that we're treating the effects of depression rather than looking at its root cause, or in other words, we're treating the smoke while ignoring the fire. So, what is this fire? Well, for decades we believed it was this chemical imbalance of serotonin and dopamine in the brain. Too little serotonin, too much cortisol. Adjust the chemicals, problem solved. However, recent studies from the NIH now find that depression is also linked to changes in gene expression levels. Gene expression is the process by which certain genes are activated or deactivated in order to produce or synthesize different proteins that perform different functions. So, to better understand this, imagine your DNA as the library of your life. Each book in this library represents a different gene. And just as each book reads a different story, each gene performs a different function. Each cell in your body has access to all the books that are located in this library. However, not all books are read at the same time. This is why you have specialized cells that perform different functions. Unlike cancer, depression doesn't destroy any of the books in this library. Instead, it just locks the door to some of the most important ones. For example, depression makes it so that way your cells aren't able to read genetic instructions that allow for brain cells to grow, communicate, and respond to stress. This means that, in essence, instead of just looking at the amount of chemicals that are in that library, we should also be looking at how neurons are able to actually read these genetic instructions. And that's where my research comes in. In my research, I was able to look at these gene expression levels in order to identify which doors are being locked by depression. Specifically, by analyzing gene expression levels in the brain, I was able to identify a potential genetic biomarker for depression. Additionally, I was able to use machine learning techniques in order to diagnose depression based off of gene expression levels. Once I had identified the potential genetic biomarker of depression, I then charted its biological pathways and the different proteins that it produces in order to identify which proteins were being affected and how. By doing so, I was able to create the chemical composition of a drug against depression using a molecular docking software. Ultimately, my model was able to outperform state-of-the-art models with a 93% accuracy in diagnosing depression. Additionally, the chemical composition of my drug proved to be effective at addressing the problem of depression on a molecular level. For too long, our society has looked at the words "I'm depressed" and "I'm sad" as being synonymous to one another without realizing the truly devastating, deadly impacts depression has on its patients. It is these misconceptions that allow such a stigma around depression to have occurred, in which we now believe that depression is the product of laziness, weakness, or a personality flaw. However, if we look past these negative attributes and realize that depression is more than just the stigma that surrounds it, we can realize that depression is a problem that is worth fighting for. So, what should you guys do? Well, imagine this, a future in which an overwhelmed patient goes to the doctor in order to get a diagnosis and treatments. The doctor, after a simple blood test, diagnoses the patient with depression due to the overregulation of a certain genetic biomarker for it. Then, instead of doing trial and error for different medications, a targeted treatment plan is set in place, in which targeted antidepressants and targeted therapy sessions allow the patient to have a fast, smooth recovery. Now, this may sound like science fiction, but it's not. It's the reality in which our current disease and disorder diagnostics and therapeutics are currently headed in. And it's something that I would like to see for depression disease and diagnostics as well, or depression diagnostics and therapeutics as well. But it doesn't just stop there. Too often, when we look at the problem of depression, we stop at the surface. We say, oh, they're just sad, or that's just how it is. But if we look at that simple and ordinary surface problem of depression, we can find that the problem is so much more complex and that extraordinary solutions are required to solve it. If research has taught me anything, it's that no matter how insignificant a problem may seem, there is always something worth solving for that may be extraordinary or amazing. Specifically, the solution may not seem as obvious. It might even be hidden in our biology. But if we're willing to take one step in and look at the problem from all of its dimensions, we can find solutions that are more reliable, effective, and efficient. And this doesn't just apply for depression. There's a whole landscape of mental health disorders, such as anxiety, PTSD, and bipolar disorder, each of which have their own genetic, psychological, and environmental dimensions to them. If we apply this scientific precision when looking at depression and finding better ways to diagnose and treat it, then we can use this as a template for when we try to apply it to these other mental health disorders in order to give them the respect, innovation, and care that they deserve. So, overall, when we're looking at these different therapeutics and ideas and ideologies, We need to make sure that we're giving each and every disease and diagnostic tool the care that it deserves. Because if we really think about it, science and empathy are intertwined. In medicine, every breakthrough, every scientific discovery, and every new insight comes from a person who is struggling, a person who is suffering, a person who is fighting for their very right to survive. And if we can look at that person with an open mind, scientifically and socially, we can do more than just help them feel better. We can transform lives. Thank you.